Hello, everyone. What I'm taking out now is a prime lens that is regarded as top tier, released at the end of February 2025. For more than a year, I kept watching and waiting for its price to come down little by little. Finally, during this spring's manufacturer promotion, I gritted my teeth and decided not to wait any longer. I brought home what is, for me personally, the most wallet-draining Nikon lens I have ever bought, the Z35mm f1.2s. I bought it. Actually, several years ago, I had already bought its sibling, the 50mm f1.2. That is a standard lens, and also my favorite and most frequently used ultra-large aperture lens. It certainly isn't light, and carrying it around does add some burden, but I still often find myself willing to put it in my bag. With it, I have captured many videos and photos that I personally really like. For example, Mount Fuji and cherry blossoms in spring, fireflies dancing at night in summer, evenings filled with lights and a touch of classical romance, and that moving, inexplicable sense of melancholy in the autumn rain. Precisely because I kept shooting more and more, I began to feel more and more clearly that if the angle of view could be a little wider, many scenes would be easier to shoot and would also feel more natural. So I had always been looking forward to a Nikon Z-mount 35mm lens with an f1.2 aperture. However, when I first heard last year that its launch price would be a 437,800 yen in Japan, $2,799.95 in US market, I couldn't help but gasp. The urge to own it immediately was instantly suppressed, and I instead began seriously thinking about whether this lens was really worth that price. Later, a 35mm f1.2 lens from a third-party manufacturer was also released, and quite a few well-known bloggers at home and abroad praised it online. There was overwhelming praise, saying that it was very capable and more attractive in price. To be honest, I was indeed somewhat tempted at the time. That was until I watched Lens Duo's video. What exactly do you get for spending 3 times as much? Once again, it confirmed what I had always believed. When it comes to gear reviews, it is better to trust users who actually spend their own money, buy the equipment themselves, use it seriously, and then share their experience. Their reviews are often closer to real-world use, more comprehensive, and more worth referring to. Because only when you truly know where a lens falls short, and whether those shortcomings will affect your own shooting, are you less likely to regret buying it.
But whatever. So, a decent lens? Well, not bad. Thank you, Viltrox, for sending it on out there. I like our partnership where you send me expensive lenses, I sell them off and buy better lenses. You may not be aware of it, but that's what's happening, and I enjoy it, and I think you do too. So.
After that, I checked around on price comparison websites. The price of a Nikon 35mm f1.2s had already fallen below 350,000 yen, which converts to US dollar less than $2,200. On top of that, there had recently been a 20,000 yen, about $125, cashback promotion. The third-party lens was selling in Japan for about 180,000 yen, over $1,100, but that website had almost no genuine user reviews or feedback. This stood in sharp contrast to the explosive praise from influencers. Also, among the relatively small number of Z-mount lenses I own, one is the 24 to 70mm f4s zoom lens that came with my Z7 kit back then. Whenever I need to shoot scenes around a 35mm angle of view, I have always used that lens. So today I want to seriously talk about this. Why then did I still decide to add Nikon's 35mm f1.2 lens to my kit? As for the technical specifications and exterior design of the Z35mm f1.2s, there's already a great deal of very detailed information online, so I will not repeat it here. Rather than simply listing specifications, I would prefer to combine this with my own real-world shooting experience and talk about what truly matters to me about this lens, what advantages it has that make me willing to pay more for it, and in what kinds of shooting situations it can genuinely help push the image closer to an ultimate state. The lens I currently have on hand is the 24 to 70mm f4. Although some people call it a kit lens, in my view it is a very sharp, very capable, and very lightweight lens. Back then, I even felt that the 24 to 70mm f2.8 in the professional zoom trinity did not offer an obvious enough advantage for me, so I simply skipped it. Because if we look only from the perspective of documentation, f4 and f2.8 are only one stop apart. If I really encounter a scene that needs an f2.8 aperture, I can use a 70 to 200mm lens on the telephoto end, a 14 to 24mm lens on the wide-angle end, and larger aperture 35mm and 50mm primes for the middle focal lengths. If portability is not the top priority, this is actually a very comfortable focal length setup. Of course, the difference between the professional zoom trinity and the mid-range zoom trinity is definitely not just that one stop of aperture. This same logic can also be used to understand the difference between native f1.2 lenses and comparable third-party lenses. When people talk about the quality of an f1.2 large aperture 35mm prime lens, their first reaction is often in-focus sharpness and out-of-focus blur, what is commonly described as razor sharp with creamy bokeh. It is as if the sharper the focused area is, the more premium the lens must be. If a third-party lens has background blur similar to the native lens, and its in-focus sharpness can approach or even surpass the native lens, then its performance would seem to have reached the top, leaving only value for money to discuss. But I think this view is actually somewhat one-sided and can even be misleading. I once compared two native Nikon 50mm lenses whose prices differed by a factor of 10, and in video footage, the difference in center sharpness between them was very hard to see. There are many factors that determine the quality of a lens. Rather than discussing razor sharpness and creamy bokeh, what I care about more is the often mystified idea of three-dimensional rendering. In other words, the subject in a photo should not merely pop out from a blurred background. There should also be front-to-back layering, creating a sense of spatial depth like what we see in reality. I think one important factor in whether a lens can render this sense of depth is that outlines must be clear and sharp, while subject detail must not be distorted. Of course, sharpening in post can also enhance three-dimensionality to some extent, but it can easily strengthen details in both the background and the subject that should not be emphasized, making the image feel less natural and less comfortable instead. What I find wonderful about Nikon's f1.2 lenses is that they can outline a human subject very clearly, while still preserving natural tonal and textural transitions within the subject. Together with a background blur, the result is soft and well-controlled. I believe that in designing and manufacturing this class of lenses, Nikon has truly put a great deal of effort into details such as chromatic aberration, optical aberrations, and diffraction compensation. Simply put, if you only want blur, you just make the aperture larger. If you only want sharpness, post-processing can also achieve that. But truly natural depth comes from precise yet not excessive sharpness, along with smooth and coherent transitions into blur. Compared with its 50mm sibling, this Nikon 35mm lens is in no way inferior in three-dimensional rendering. And because its angle of view is wider, it is also easier to preserve the structure of the background. Of course, the blur created by a large aperture is only a background for giving an image a sense of depth. The distance relationship between the subject and the camera affects how three-dimensionality appears with different focal lengths, how well the depth of field around the subject is controlled, and whether the composition contains foreground and background layers, all affect whether a two-dimensional photo can ultimately look as if it has a three-dimensional subject that pops out of the frame. Those who know. For many men, the journey through photography probably goes something like this. When young, they are portrait photography enthusiasts. After getting married, they become the dedicated portrait photographer at home. Later on, they have no choice but to turn to landscape photography and eventually, little by little, become full-time bird photographers. The 35mm focal length is actually very well suited to documentary and humanistic photography. As a seasoned photography enthusiast, when I use an f1.2 large aperture 35mm lens, of course I will also take a moderate number of flattering portraits of my wife, but its main purpose is still to shoot scenes in weak light, low light, and even extremely challenging backlit conditions. If we are only talking about ordinary landscape photography, the Z-mount 24 to 70mm f4 lens is already excellent enough, especially when stopped down to around f8. In terms of sharpness, it is actually difficult for us to tell at a glance the difference between images shot with it and those shot with the Z35mm f1.2. But in a deep, secluded valley rarely visited by people, the situation becomes quite different. Steep cliffs and dense forests block almost all direct sunlight, and the deeper you walk in, the more you feel a chilling sense of mystery. In this kind of dim lighting environment, the usual approach is to raise the ISO to obtain enough exposure. But for landscape photographers who are used to ISO 64 and pursue the cleanest possible image quality, if you're photographing rocks or waterfalls at a certain distance, and you can confirm that enough depth of field will be preserved, then using an f1.2 aperture can shorten the exposure time. When taking photos, this makes it less likely for wind-blown leaves to create overlapped ghosting. When recording video, since shutter speed is already constrained, a large aperture can also help the image maintain a better signal-to-noise ratio. If f1.2 is not necessarily required in a deep forest during the daytime, then when shooting city streets at night, The larger the aperture, the better. For example, if we first look at a night street scene in Tokyo shot with a 50mm prime lens, and then look at a night scene in Nagoya shot with this 35mm prime, you can clearly feel that the 35mm angle of view is wider and closer to the natural field of view we have when looking at the world with both eyes. Compared with 50mm, it can include more information, and the image also feels more immersive. The f1.2 aperture lets us keep ISO very low when shooting at night, while still getting enough exposure. As a result, the image looks extremely clean. On top of that, this lens performs very well against backlight, which I will discuss in detail later. Even when oncoming headlights are so bright that they feel dazzling to the human eye, the image it captures can actually look clearer and more transparent than what I felt on location with my naked eyes. One more thing needs to be added here. Because the car window glass had a lot of dust on it, its impact on light transmission and scattering really cannot be ignored. The image shown here actually does not reach the level of backlight performance this lens should be capable of. To show that equipment is quite important in this kind of night scene, let us also show footage shot with a Z6 II and the 24 to 70mm f4 zoom lens, set to 4K 60p, ISO 3200, recording 8-bit SDR footage of Tokyo's Ginza, and compare it with screenshots from Nagoya City footage shown earlier. Shot with the Z8 and the 35mm f1.2 prime at 8K 30p, ISO 800 in 10-bit M-Log. Starry sky landscapes are also a subject where a 35mm f1.2 large aperture lens can perform very well. Because the aperture is large enough, the shutter speed can be kept under 10 seconds, which helps reduce the problem of stars stretching into trails. Even without a star tracker, it can still capture star points fairly well. The perspective of 35mm is also relatively natural, and foreground elements generally are not exaggeratedly stretched. With the Nikon Z35mm f1.2s at maximum aperture, star point aberrations are controlled fairly well in the center of the frame, or image field, but the edges of the image field, there's a slight comet-like tail and a faint wing shape. That said, the oval deformation of stars at the edges is not very large, and chromatic aberration is not outrageous either. Across the whole frame, only a small number of white star points show obvious purple fringing. This becomes more noticeable after grayscale, stretching in post. Vignetting is also fairly strong, but controllable, and after correction, the lens's vignetting and chromatic aberration can basically be eliminated. For someone like me who is not a professional astrophotographer, it is basically good enough. Perhaps lenses with an f1.2 large aperture are indeed very difficult to make perfect, and in pursuit of the so-called 3D hi-fi rendering, some aberrations may be introduced. From the perspective of pursuing the absolute extreme, I think this lens is probably not one optimized specifically for shooting the stars. During the shoot, because the Milky Way was positioned rather high and the moonlight was relatively bright, I did not capture the ideal result, but judging from the sample images, they're already enough to illustrate the point. In addition, the 35mm angle of view is, after all, not especially wide, so without stitching, the subjects it can cover are still somewhat limited. Therefore, for astrophotography, I still prefer using a 14 to 24mm ultra-wide-angle lens. Next, let's talk about the most extreme and also the most romantic example of low-light shooting I have encountered: photographing fireflies on a pitch-black early summer night. This is a shooting scenario that is both highly poetic and highly demanding technically. The advantages of the Z35mm f1.2s become especially obvious in this kind of situation. Even wide open at f1.2, its point light aberrations remain very low, and edge light points can still stay close to circular. Because yellow-green firefly light contains little blue, there's almost no obvious purple fringing, and the firefly light points look clean and sharp enough. Fireflies do not glow continuously. They flash intermittently, floating and drifting through the air. When captured on video, the feeling is a little like light breathing, real, yet with a touch of dreaminess. Video is different from still photography. You cannot use a 4 to 6 second long exposure the way you can with photos. For the Z8, even in extreme conditions, each frame can accumulate only about 1/4 of a second of incoming light at most. And if you want to show the natural movement of fireflies, the shutter time is preferably faster than 1/15 second. On a pitch black night without moonlight or starlight, even a top-tier lens like this still has a hard time rendering background objects, such as trees, very clearly. From this perspective, it is not unreasonable to say that a phone is not necessarily worse than a top-end camera. But if we make use of the faint light from a phone screen, the camera can record that quiet and wonderful atmosphere of people watching fireflies. That is something today's phones are probably absolutely unable to do. Of course, if we argue that one must buy the native 35mm f1.2 lens purely from a standpoint of exposure, that alone is actually hard to make fully convincing. As mentioned earlier, the several-fold price difference between lenses usually does not come only from aperture size. It also comes from differences in design philosophy, manufacturing processes, material costs, and quality control standards. Especially in areas such as chromatic aberration, vignetting control, sunstar rendering, resistance to flare and backlight, and focus breathing, the gap is often very obvious. One thing I quite like is that Nikon gave this lens an 82mm filter diameter. At the very least, this means a larger front element design, making it easier for marginal rays to enter the lens. As a result, vignetting can be controlled more naturally, and edge image quality can also remain more stable. The Z35mm f1.2s has 11 aperture blades, the highest number currently found in Nikon's Z-mount lineup, which allows it to produce the sharpest 22-point sunstars, while the Z50mm f1.2s, with its 9 aperture blades, produces a softer 18-point sunstar, freeing while the more affordable Z24 to 70mm f4s, with its 7 aperture blades, produces a harder-edged 14-point sunstar. The three lenses have completely different sunstar characteristics, which also reveals Nikon's trade-offs in positioning different lenses. Compared with white sunstars, which are zero-order primary diffraction fringes, rainbow sunstars are essentially wavelength separation caused by plus or minus 1 order diffraction of white light, but the optical quality of the lens itself affects how this dispersion appears. The fewer the aperture blades, the sharper their edges, and the weaker the coating, the more obvious this diffraction dispersion becomes. It is not the so-called chromatic aberration in lens imaging that is usually caused by optical glass elements, but an optical diffraction phenomenon created when intense white light passes through an edge, a small opening, or a grating. So the rainbow sunstars we see are actually closely related to lens design. Lens design determines whether you can easily see rainbow sunstars. Unless you're shooting directly into the sun, Nikon's 35mm f1.2 belongs to the kind of lens where they are not especially easy to see. But once they do appear, if you observe its rainbow sunstars carefully, you can see dispersion both radially and in the direction rotating around the light rays. Because backlight is the situation where a lens's weaknesses are most easily exposed, the thing I value most is this lens's backlight performance. On this lens, Nikon uses nano crystal coat, Yaranio coat, and meso-amorphous coat, as well as an optimized optical path design to reduce internal reflections. This is the kind of foundational capability that is hardest for native lens makers to be copied on. Online, you can occasionally see people showing flare and ghosting from this lens. Here I should also point out that flare and ghosting are often closely related to front filters. If a string of light spots appears along with sunstars in the frame, especially when paired with a beautiful landscape, then on a lens with such strong flare resistance, is actually something that can be hard to come by. Putting aside the aesthetic value of the image, let's look at examples of flare and ghosting caused by direct sunlight. As you can see in the image, if a protective filter is attached, flare increases noticeably. If you only see 2 green light spots in the frame, they're most likely caused by the front filter, so you can try removing it first. I generally use Nikon's R-Crest filter, which produces relatively less flare. When necessary, slightly shading the area above the lens with your palm can also help improve the situation. Next, let's look at a very interesting real-world example, light beams in a deep forest valley. This is one of the hardest subjects in photography to capture well, and also one of the easiest to make feel almost miraculous. It is not ordinary backlight, nor simply a beam of light. Rather, it is volumetric light, formed by the combined effects of humidity, vegetation density, light angle, airborne particles, and terrain structure. Next, let's talk about how this lens performs when shooting light beams in a deep forest valley. The coating on Nikon's 35mm f1.2 performs extremely well in backlit situations. Ghosting and flare are minimal, and contrast remains stable. The edges of the light beams stay clean, and overall contrast does not collapse. As long as you're not shooting wide open at f1.2, purple fringing does not appear easily in the frame, and the beams will not turn into a wash of white fog. In addition, besides requiring the right weather and environmental conditions, light rays and beams also need to appear within a dark scene in order to be seen easily. To capture foreground and background elements such as leaves, flowing water, moss, and rocks while under backlight and low light, increase the amount of incoming light while ensuring that the light beams and leaves do not become overexposed, thereby improving the signal-to-noise ratio in the shadows. When shutter speed is limited, this lens's natural angle of view, fully adjustable large aperture, and strong backlight capability allow us to capture video of this kind of light in the air in a way that feels both realistic and dreamlike. That day, we also used f4 zoom lenses, the 14 to 30 millimeters and 24 to 70 millimeters, to shoot. Because the best window for the light beams lasted only a few minutes, and because we wanted to use the Z8 to shoot 8K video, we only switched to the 14 to 30 millimeters lens once during that period. For the most part, we mounted those two lenses on the Z7 and Z6 II, respectively, for shooting. I should clarify here that this entire video should not be treated as a strict comparative review, because in real-world shooting, it is very difficult to keep environmental conditions completely identical. The comparison shown here is only meant to illustrate the different impressions created by the extreme and the ordinary. We also compare footage shot with an iPhone and a GoPro. This is not meant to belittle anyone or anything. You can understand it this way. This is what the extreme can achieve, and this is how far ordinary gear may fall short. As you can see, lenses that do not use Nikon's latest coating technology and better internal light suppression techniques, although their backlight performance can still be described as usable or even good in most situations. But once you enter this kind of special scenario, ghosting and flare become very glaring, contrast drops more noticeably, and the shadows are more likely to take on a hazy look. The edges of highlights are also more prone to halos, which causes edge deformation and makes the image less aesthetically pleasing. In conclusion, in terms of in-focus clarity, this 35mm f1.2 lens does not show an obvious advantage over other lenses. But when it comes to backlight performance and sunstar rendering, it can indeed be described as excellent. However, as mentioned earlier in the astrophotography section, when this 35mm prime is used wide open at f1.2, purple fringing and chromatic dispersion are still very noticeable. Of course, with software correction, most results are not a problem. But in a very small number of cases, they cannot be corrected with existing software. This may involve highlight handling after demiscing of image raw data. Most of these cases are likely caused by overexposed highlights, and they may be avoidable by slightly reducing exposure during shooting. In addition, from the perspective of compositional convenience, a prime lens is much more limited than a zoom lens. At times like this, a standard zoom lens with the latest coating technology may actually be more appealing. Next, let's talk about something that matters a great deal in video shooting: focus breathing. When shooting video, we often encounter this kind of situation. Within the same frame, the focus point needs to move from a subject in the foreground to another subject in the background, or a subject moves through the frame and the lens needs to keep tracking focus on it. What no one wants to see in that moment is the entire image seeming to grow larger or smaller as soon as the focus point changes, or even objects at the edges shifting slightly, or the whole frame giving a small twitch. This uncomfortable phenomenon is called focus breathing. Simply put, it means the angle of view, or the effective focal length, changes as the lens focuses. Usually, you can judge how strong it is by observing how objects near the edges of the frame move. But when the camera itself is moving, this method of judging focus breathing no longer applies. For example, when shooting from a moving car. Note that focus hunting in car-mounted footage is often related to the autofocus mode selected, so it cannot be blamed entirely on the camera. For example, in this scene, I used a fixed-point single-point AF mode without setting a focus range limit. By chance, the focus point suddenly shifted from the street scene to the sky, so the camera's autofocus struggled for a moment. I think the focus breathing of Nikon's 35mm f1.2s is relatively low. This means that its angle of view remains nearly consistent across different focus positions, from near to far. Some older lenses changed their angle of view so much that rather than calling them prime lenses, it may be more accurate to call them tiny zoom lenses. Even Nikon's own S-line lenses generally control focus breathing quite well, but even a little extra breathing can become amplified in video footage. For example, the 14 to 24 millimeters lens, which is often regarded as a legendary wide-angle member of the professional zoom trinity, can still produce somewhat unpleasant footage if it twitches when paired with a Z6 II, whose autofocus is not especially stable. Finally, let's talk about autofocus performance. In other words, the coordination between a native lens and the camera body. Nikon's 35mm f1.2s uses multiple STM stepping motors working together to drive the focusing system, and it also works more deeply with the Z8's autofocus algorithm. In actual use, the most obvious feeling is this. Even in low light, it can still hold onto the subject fairly steadily, and is not especially prone to losing focus in low-contrast scenes. When tracking focus during video shooting, it also does not hunt or shake easily. Here I also want to add that STM stepping motors are actually already good enough. In theory, if a smoother and faster voice coil motor such as SSV-CM were used, focusing could of course be faster and more accurate. But conversely, using STM also has one benefit. It can reduce some viewers' concerns about off-axis issues. On the contrary, I actually have another concern. For Nikon, is the machining precision of the guide rails in a voice coil motor really more difficult than the gear meshing precision of a stepping motor? We know that Nikon has recently given Z lenses a focus range limiter function, which is used to improve AF accuracy, but older F-mount lenses have been excluded from it. Think about it. If even the legitimate child born from an ex-wife of more than 60 years can have its functions cut back, if Nikon wanted to do it, it would also be very easy for them to make third-party lenses somewhat lacking in autofocus performance, always feeling just a step slower or just a little less precise compared with the native lens's system-level coordination. For example, some users have reported that when using third-party Z-mount lenses, pinpoint AF always seems to focus just slightly differently compared with single-point AF, and the manufacturer has openly acknowledged the issue, saying it will be improved later through a firmware update. This makes us seriously wonder how many subtle camera functions may fail to work when we actually need them. Of course, we will try to assume the best. Honest old Nikon probably would not intentionally restrict features. At most, it might be unintentional. For example, the Z8 does not use an all-metal body shell, perhaps to shave a little weight off one of the heaviest mirrorless bodies. Yet it is willing to show overheating warnings from time to time. Also, although NRAW is clearly linear raw data, after computer decoding, it still insists on being limited to a RecPoint 2020 color gamut, causing the so-called blue clipping issue to stir up quite a commotion. Even now, people still have to manually rename files to our 3D to settle the matter. At that point, I happened to come across a review by the respected Mr. Martin.
You go to a comic convention with two, and the lens ends up breaking. You say it's okay, just take a new one out of your bag and keep using it. It's only half the price of the original, so the cost effectiveness is very high.
Another example that combines focus breathing, autofocus, and trading aperture for shutter speed is shooting fast-moving subjects. Let's see how this lens handles scenarios such as rapid driving at night or on skyline highways. First, its autofocus is very stable. Once focus is acquired, obvious loss of focus basically does not occur. Second, its focus breathing is extremely low. When a car is moving at high speed, the overall image does not show any uncomfortable change in angle of view. However, the Z8 body still seems to have considerable room for improvement in recognizing and autofocusing on extremely small subjects. Next, please take a look at sample images shot with this lens while listening to my thoughts on buying lenses. I already have a 24 to 70mm f4 zoom lens that covers the 35mm focal length, and it is basically enough for ordinary travel and everyday shooting. But it is just a little lacking in background blur, backlight performance, and low-light situations. So over the years, I have actually used the 50mm f1.2 more often instead. Now I have bought this Z35mm f1.2s. The reason is actually simple. I wanted a slightly wider field of view, with images that feel more natural and have stronger layering and depth, while also getting cleaner and more refined results as much as possible in backlit and low-light environments. And because I often shoot video, autofocus needs to be stable without constantly missing focus. And then there is focus breathing, which is also very important. I am very clear that a lens being heavy and expensive is simply the price you pay for it. It is unrealistic to expect the horse to run fast while also expecting it not to eat. Weight and price are costs, but insufficient performance or missing functions are real problems. The two should not be mixed together in the same calculation. If a tool lets you down at the very moment you truly need it, then it is not full of character. It simply is not good enough. For example, if you need to shoot in low light, but the aperture is not large enough, exposure is insufficient, and autofocus cannot keep up, and when shooting video the image keeps twitching now and then, that is not merely slightly lacking. It means the tool is genuinely unusable. Of course, software technology is also very powerful now, and some optical flaws can indeed be rescued somewhat in post-processing, such as distortion, longitudinal chromatic aberration, and focus breathing. Software can help patch them up to some extent. However, this also takes time, effort, and sometimes even money. It can be counted as another kind of cost. So when it comes to cost, the question is whether you can accept it. It is something that can be considered and negotiated. The weight of a lens can be negotiated with your own physical strength, and the price of a lens can be negotiated with your own wallet. Those optical flaws that software can fix can also be negotiated with your own perfectionism and slightly obsessive personality. What I want to say here is that when buying a lens, price is of course important, and budget is even the first hurdle in shopping. It determines what level of gear we can buy and what kind of experience we can get. But for most people, lenses aren't something you frequently buy and sell. They should be tools that accompanies you for a long time. So what really matters is whether the lens as a tool is enough to reach the range you want to capture, whether it can handle actual shooting, whether it's reliable at critical moments, and whether a once-in-a-lifetime shot might fall apart. Only when two lenses have truly similar functions and performance, and those small differences don't obviously affect your real shooting, should price, or we could say cost-effectiveness, be used as the final deciding factor. As for whether Nikon's 35mm f1.2 lens is expensive, I think the price has been steadily dropping, and the manufacturer even added a summer rebate of 30,000 yen, about $185. These facts are enough to answer the question. To be clear, its launch price was indeed much higher compared to other lenses with the same f1.2 aperture. That's also why I hesitated to buy it for a long time. However, these top-tier lenses are originally aimed at a very specific group of users. Their audience is small, so pricing naturally reflects sales expectations. The market price, in turn, determines whether users are willing to pay. This is why top-tier lenses come with top-tier prices. And because of that, some people see others buying these lenses and think either they're showing off or they're getting ripped off. But through this video, I want to say that's not necessarily true. Some people really need it, and some truly love it. Finally, if you ask me about third-party lenses, my answer is, I haven't used them, so I don't feel comfortable giving a random opinion. But it's precisely because competitors exist that Nikon's 35mm f1.2 price has come down and is returning to a reasonable range faster. As users, we hope for fair and healthy competition among all manufacturers. All right. That's it for today. Thanks for watching until the end, and we'll see you in the next video.